Here in the heart of Andalusia, Spain, surrounded by beautiful countryside, stands Cordoba, a thriving city with an ancient past. Steeped in history, it's a tourist dream, and as one wanders down the old patios and lanes, passing by taverns and restaurants galore, it's easy to get caught up in the atmosphere of this ancient city. But for many, the charm and quality of today's Cordoba mask the painful events that took place in its past. From the time of the Romans, Spain has witnessed the coming and goings of multiple ruling powers, from the early years of the Christian Visigoth kings through the conquest of the Muslims, and then once again into the hands of the well-established Catholic monarchy. Caught in between this dramatic ebb and flow of history were exiles of the ancient people of Israel, the Jews. We're here in the oldest medieval synagogue, the only surviving synagogue in the south of Spain from that era, built in 1375. And you can see here the eastern wall with the inscriptions from the Psalms. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that I may seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. At one time, there was a thriving Jewish community here in Cordoba, a bustling metropolis of the Middle Ages, much like modern-day London or New York. So what happened here? What took place that would decimate a once thriving Jewish community? Historically, Jewish heritage is in literature, philosophy and medicine, and not construction, which explains why there is little in these surroundings that would suggest there was ever a large Jewish population. On the other hand, we can clearly see the influence of the Muslim inhabitants, who brought with them the architectural styles of the Middle East and North Africa. Once the great Mosque of Cordoba, now a cathedral, the Mezquita shows the richness and quality of the Moorish architects. When the Moors arrived here, they replaced the Christian Visigoth kings. This mainly Catholic monarchy had in its own turn severely persecuted the Jews with forced conversion, separation and exile. The Moors, on the other hand, had more in common with the Jews than the Christians. Neither accepted the divinity of Jesus or the idea of the Holy Trinity, and although the Jews were second-class citizens, they were still treated well and generally respected by their rulers. This would be the start of what would be a period of prosperity for this area of Spain and for the Jewish people, a time that is known by many Jews as the Golden Age of Judaism.
When we were living in a Muslim territory, in a Muslim kingdom, is when we got our golden age, which is as well something very necessary to recover nowadays when we think that Jews and Muslims, we are like enemies and it looks like we were enemies. No, the most important time in the Jewish history took place in Muslim countries, in the Muslim society, like that important Jewish community in the old Babylon in Baghdad, or our Jewish community here, or the Jewish community of Egypt, in Alexandria, in Cairo, or in Morocco. Really, a big part of the Jewish history is connected with Muslim history, and that's something as well very necessary to recover nowadays. So at the 10th century, the Caliph of Cordoba was created by Abd ar-Rahman, and Cordoba became the center of culture in the Western countries, the biggest city in the Western countries. We are starting our golden age during that Muslim period.
In this time of relative peace and economic prosperity, the Jews, known by the Muslims as the people of the book, were allowed to enter areas of society that had previously been prohibited. Some made their way into the civil service and others into banking and commerce. They could practice their faith without fear of forced conversions or exile, and were allowed to live respectably within their own communities. So this was a period of great learning, a time when education, medicine, and especially philosophy blossomed. A testament to what can be achieved given the right environment. Next to me is a statue of one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of this time, Maimonides, born here in Cordoba in 1135.
Maimonides is the most important philosopher in Jewish history, and he's considered like the second Moses in the history of Judaism. Thanks to Maimonides, we could understand the Torah. That's why in the history of Judaism, Maimonides is considered a kind of a second Moses, because the first Moses got the Torah, and this second one, Maimonides, helped us to understand the Torah. So that's why in Hebrew we say, Mimoshe le Moshe, lo hayam ke Moshe. From Moses to Moses, there was not another Moses.
In time, Muslim rulers gradually became less tolerant of non-Muslims, and in particular Jews and Christians, whose beliefs according to Islamic theology had been replaced by the final and true revelation of Allah through Muhammad. New regulations slowly came into force. Jews and Christians, for example, were not allowed to own taller houses than the Muslims, and they were relegated to certain low-level jobs and banned from publicly expressing any sign of their faith. This was not only a throwback to pre-Golden Age anti-Jewish attitudes, but a harbinger of worse to come. In 1066, a Muslim mob stormed the royal palace in Granada and assassinated the Jewish vizier. Many Jews were also massacred throughout the city. By the time the great philosopher Maimonides was born, the religious and political environment was increasingly menacing and unstable for the general Jewish population. In a relatively short time, the Jews were once again threatened with conversion, death, or exile. Many Jews chose to leave Spain, including the family of Maimonides.
The Almohads were Muslim people from Morocco. They were not Arabs, they were Berbers, Muslim Berbers, with a very radical concept of the Islamic religion. Their capital was in Marrakesh, in South Morocco, and they conquered the Muslim territories of Spain. During that period, the Jewish minority, the Christian minority, and even many Muslims were persecuted. They didn't allow to those minorities to stay here, but as well they persecuted many Muslim people who had not the same concept of religion as they had.
As with all civilizations and kingdoms, Muslim dominance was to eventually come to an end. Arguments from within among Muslim leaders vying for power meant that the Christian North could press down upon an ever-weakening Muslim rule. In the 13th century, several major cities, including Toledo, Sevilla, and Cordoba, were to fall to the conquistadors, and by 1492, Muslims had lost all power in Spain. Initially, the Reconquest brought little change for the Spanish Jews. Robbing and killing were not uncommon by crusaders initiating their own holy war. However, King Ferdinand III, in his desire to create a stable society, allowed Jews from northern Spain to return to Cordoba and settle here, in what was to become known as the Jewish Quarter. Protected on all sides by walls, it was to become a haven for its inhabitants, allowing them to once again briefly prosper and blossom as a Jewish community. So the Jews, now safe in Cordoba, were tax-paying citizens guarded by the king, walled in but safe in this quarter of the city. It seems that given the opportunity, the Jews would prosper in their environment. Maybe their commitment to education, to commerce, to science and medicine would promote them to higher positions within the society. Maybe their ability to cope, to live under the pressure of hatred over the centuries gave them strength to endure and overcome. But if God had given them blessings and the ability to prosper, then what was given with one hand was apparently taken away with the other. It wasn't long before persecution would again rear its ugly head. Moses' words from Deuteronomy 28:65 indeed carry the weight of truth. And among the nations you shall find no rest. 14th century Spain is a difficult time for all. Not only civil war between King Peter I and his half-brother Henry, resulting in the death of Peter, but also hard economic times. And across Europe, the Black Death, where towns and communities would lose up to 60% of their populations to the plague. In response, the populations looked for someone to blame. Predictably and tragically, the Jews, as a minority, became the obvious target.
The Jews were guilty of the Civil War. The Jews were guilty of the Black Plague. People say that they put something wrong into the water, into the wells of the city, into the cistern of the city. So Jews were guilty of the Black Plague. Jews were guilty of the economic crisis. Jews basically were guilty of everything.
As if it wasn't hard enough for the Jews already, another accusation was to be thrown their way. In the eyes of Christians, they were now solely responsible for the death of Jesus. In an age where few could read, and of those who could, only priests were allowed to read the Bible, it's easy to see how the people could be persuaded to believe anything they were told. How easily the gospel of Christ, designed to bring good news, when twisted to fit with the ambitions of men and governments, could be used as a tool for evil. In this instance, to excuse death, persecution, and exile for the Jews.
Jews were guilty, but in some ways, non-Jews were guilty as well, because they were allowing to those people who killed Jesus, they were allowing them to stay. So Jews were guilty of those problems. But the Christians were guilty for having the Jews living in a Christian country, for having in a Christian country those people who killed Jesus. So imagine the situation of the Jews.
So persecution returns to the doorstep of the Jew and escalates. Anti-Jewish prejudices among the people resulted in segregation, with Jews forced to wear the now familiar, shameful yellow badges to set them apart. Eventually, this led to intimidation and physical threats of violence. In July 1391, Spain once again witnessed the bloodshed of Jews. In Sevilla, hundreds of Jews were killed with the encouragement of preaching by Ferran de Martínez, a priest of Sevilla. This violence became a catalyst for a summer of brutal attacks on Jewish communities throughout Spain. Here in Cordoba, the entire Jewish quarter was burnt down, factories and warehouses destroyed. By the time the dust had settled, over 2,000 corpses lay in the streets and in the wreckage of the houses and synagogues.
So at 1391, even there were many communities which, at least officially, disappear. 100 years before 1492. We have the examples of Ciudad Real, close to Toledo, and even Barcelona. Officially, the Jewish community disappeared in those cities at 1391. Why? Because many of them were killed, many of them converted to Christianity, and other members of the communities moved to North Africa and as well to the Ottoman Empire.
Jews now started converting to Christianity in mass numbers to escape the persecution. However, instead of putting an end to their suffering, it was to herald a whole new dimension to their problems. The Jews, faced with persecution or conversion, had little choice but to take the safer option. It's little wonder that these new Christian converts were treated with suspicion as to the authenticity of their conversion. Many converted simply for the safety of their families. For others, it was an opportunity to prosper within their communities. It is not surprising, therefore, that the same people who demanded the conversion of the Jews continue to treat these new Christians with suspicion, distrust, and disdain.
That conversion to Christianity was not the end of their problems, was the beginning of new problems. And when officially in Spain there were no Jews anymore, which is gonna be the minority guilty of every problem in Spain? The new Christians.
So a way was needed for them to deal with these conversos, these fake Christians. In 1449, the law of the purity of blood appeared. This was the first attempt at singling out the Jews and Muslims who were now self-proclaimed Christians. The law meant that one's Christianity came from the bloodline of their ancestors, not from professed Christian faith. This was a period of religious superstition and civil unrest. Eclipses of the sun were portents of God's impending judgment. Divisions and civil wars continued to destabilize the country. Spain needed order and unity, reassurance that God was in control. In 1480, King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I introduced the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, commonly known as the Spanish Inquisition. Inquisitors were appointed to deal with Christian heretics, namely conversos, or moriscos, their Muslim counterpart. While originally intended to deal with these fake converts, the term was to become a source of fear and punishment for all new Christians, and ultimately no one would feel safe from its power. Inquisitor generals were appointed and given an awesome responsibility. Theirs were to become the names of dread and fear among the people of Spain. The first Inquisitor General was the now infamous Thomas de Torquemada, ironically of Jewish descent. He is widely credited as the man responsible for the growth of the Inquisition throughout Spain, ruthlessly targeting any who gave even the slightest hint that they clung to any Jewish practices. To these inquisitors was given the responsibility to purge Spain of false Christianity and thus purify the Holy Catholic Church, a task which they were to ruthlessly undertake. But there was a problem. The Inquisition only had authority over those who claimed to be Christian. What about those who didn't? What about the then large Jewish community? In 1492, Torquemada brought a trumped-up charge against certain Jews and conversos, that they had crucified a Christian child and cut out his heart in a ritual that would bring madness and death to all Christians. A charge which under torture they all confessed to. This news was then spread throughout Spain and was the ultimate factor in persuading the king to bring about a Jewish exile, and thus on March 31st, 1492, all Jews were ordered to either convert or leave the kingdom.
1492 is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. But there were already a lot of people who converted to Christianity before 1492. And of course, at 1492, a lot of people converted again to Christianity, because they had to decide between converting to Christianity or leaving the country.
There could now be no seducing Jewish influence on the new Christians, no excuse for them returning to the practice of Judaism. But more importantly, now every citizen was within the reach of the inquisitors' power. Originally designed to give people an opportunity to confess that they were not faithfully following the true Catholic faith, it soon became an opportunity to denounce those whom one wanted out of the way. Business rivalries and disputing neighbours, personal jealousies or just old grudges were sufficient cause to bring accusation of heresy before the Inquisition. History tells us of the thousands who were taken by this process, their goods confiscated, their families cast out of their homes, some spending years rotting in foul prisons with little to eat. Torture was commonplace, used to bring about confessions of trumped-up accusations. Even instant admission was then followed by further torture to encourage the victim to reveal more of their heretical activities, and maybe denounce other family members or neighbours, which of course, under the torment of their suffering, they would willingly reveal, true or not. This horror would culminate in a public display, demonstrating the power and authority of the Inquisition. In this auto-da-fe or act of faith, victims were paraded through the streets, wearing humiliating robes and hats called San Benito. To be brought here to the city centre, to be tried before the inquisitors and the council officials, and after that to be sentenced to death. The crowds gathered in morbid anticipation of the execution to follow, and the victims were bound to the stake and burned to death. If you come as a tourist to Cordoba today, you'll no doubt visit the castle of the Christian monarchs. You'll be treated to a tour that includes courtyards with ponds filled with the trickling murmur of waters, exotic flowers and the aroma of herbs and mature trees. This ancient castle includes the Tower of Lions, the Tower of Doves and even a Roman sarcophagus. But also located in the far corner is the headquarters of the Inquisition. From the heights of the Alcazar, we can see clearly the city of Cordoba stretching into the distance. It was from here, starting in the late 15th century, that the Inquisition would cast its fearsome shadow over the region for the next 300 years. Nobody was safe from the Inquisition. The authority that was exercised was impossible to challenge. In their hands was literally the power over life and death, from the highest politicians and the most devout priests to the humble farmer and local peasants. All were within the radar of the inquisitors, and the accusation against them that they were secretly practicing Judaism.
How really you know someone is Jewish? is that we are different from the other people. They were dressing in a different way. They had a big nose. No. It was just watching their private lives. Because really, the place where you live, most part of your Judaism, is in your house. It's how you live in your house. So the Inquisition started watching the private life of every new Christian family.
Almost every year, thousands of people suffered torture and death. Tens of thousands more were sentenced and fined, losing their property, their livelihood, and in many cases banished from Spain. The inquisitors were in fact the only ones safe and above the law. It's not hard to imagine that aside from the obvious injustice of the system, abuses by the institution were commonplace, none more so than here in Cordoba. The year is 1499. A former school teacher, Diego Rodriguez Lotero, is appointed to Chief Inquisitor of Cordoba. Having come from Granada with an impressive reputation for unearthing heretics, he wastes no time in bringing all the power of the Inquisition to bear on the city of Cordoba. It's no accident that the majority of his targets were wealthy new Christians of high repute, nobles and gentlemen, and even church dignitaries. But many of them were also old Christians of unblemished reputation. Accusations of heresy were forthcoming, and Lutero stopped at nothing to achieve his aims. Abuse, threats and torture were used to procure whatever evidence was necessary to convict the accused. Before long, he became known as Lutero el Tenebroso, the bringer of darkness. In his pursuit of gain and power, he would stop at nothing to fulfill his desires. On one occasion, Lutero accused 25 women of being prophetesses who would travel the land in an attempt to convert it to Judaism. It was said that these prophetesses travelled as drunken bacchantes, maids of the Bacchus, the god of wine. Others were transported on goats by the powers of hell. He made sure that he had plenty of witnesses to their heretical actions by forcing prisoners under threat of torture to testify against these poor women, most of whom had never been outside the city gates. It is said that Lutero lived amongst the townspeople of Cordoba, but in reality it's unlikely that he ever left the safety of the Alcázar de los Reyes Cristianos. It was not uncommon for the people on the streets to throw stones at him or even physically attack him. Such was the passionate feeling against him from the people here in Cordoba. Complaints to the Inquisitor General Diego de Defa were fruitless, as he was happy to receive the confiscated money of these rich victims. Eventually, the outcry from the inhabitants of Cordoba against Luthero's cruel actions did bring about change, and most of his trials were declared invalid, there being no grounds for his accusations. Unfortunately, too late for the 2,500 people that he had already burnt at the stake, and the other 32,000 that had been tortured, fined, or exiled. Lutero himself, although tried, was allowed to live out his days in peace in the Sevilla canonry, which he had acquired by the ruin of the Archdeacon of Castro. East and west and south and north, no tower or town or cottage was beyond the reach of the Inquisition. Portugal suffered terribly under its curse, as did the Spanish colonial countries of South America. For nigh on 4 centuries, the Inquisition maintained its political and religious hold over the people, legitimizing banditry and murder, until finally on July 15, 1834, the Spanish Inquisition was brought to an end. On December 16th, 1968, 476 years after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella ordered the Jews to be expelled from Spain, the Spanish government declared the decree void. The Spanish Inquisition has become synonymous with intolerance and brutality, and the inquisitors with fear and intimidation. The sad truth is that the horrors suffered here were under the banner of the cross and in the name of Christian replacement theology. It would be wrong, however, to single out Spain as the only ones guilty of persecuting the Jews. In the First Crusade, the Jews were annihilated from the Rhine to Jerusalem. Christians were enjoined by Godfrey of Boulogne to go on this journey only after avenging the blood of the crucified one, by shedding Jewish blood and completely eradicating any trace of those bearing the name Jew, thus assuaging his own burning wrath. The pogroms of Eastern Europe similarly justified slaughter with the canard, death to the Christ killers. The Holocaust took place in the heart of Christendom, and its perpetrators were almost entirely baptized Christians, whether of Protestant or Catholic tradition. Nazi propaganda was fueled by Christian replacement theology, justifying segregation and yellow badges. The consequences were dehumanization, demonization, and the eventual murder of over 6 million men, women, and children in the space of 4 years. There is another level to this story about the Jews. The Bible speaks about the exile of God's chosen people, a dispersing among the nations, where they would find no rest. But does it also hold the key to this extreme persecution that they have experienced? Here in Spain, despite valiant attempts to integrate into the local religion and customs, Jews were still singled out. Moses Maimonides, perhaps the most knowledgeable of his time on the Golden Age, nonetheless concluded, the Jews, even those living within the Golden Age, were living in forced exile, awaiting the day when God would bring his ancient people back to their homeland. The Hebrew scriptures speak of a day when he who scattered Israel will gather them, as a shepherd keeps his flock. Could it be that God is keeping his exiled people as a group, protecting them from assimilation, so the unambiguous promise of return would be literally fulfilled? The Christian New Testament also speaks of blessings and restoration, with the famous untils of Jesus. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, and by consequence the Jews exiled, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And this people shall not pass away until all these things have happened. Today, Jews all over the world celebrate the Passover meal, the Seder, a tradition which stretches back through the thousands of years of their exile. They still end it with the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem," a phrase of hope of a return to a place of safety, a place of peace, and an end to their exile, an end to persecution.
חיים שיש בהם יראת שמיים ויראת בית, חיים שאין בהם בושה וכלימה, חיים של אושר וכבוד, חיים שתהיבנו אהבת התורה ויראת שמיים, חיים שימלאו